Zahra, you can be next, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Deborah, for this great panel, which is very needed. And thank you, Summia, for the great introduction to the work that you have done with journalists and the podcast that you have produced. I can start from the work that I am doing. So basically, my journalism career started in Kabul, Afghanistan in 2011. And until 2017, I was working as a journalist. So most of my time was spent working with local media in Afghanistan. And for last year that I was in Afghanistan, I was working for the New York Times. As I said before, that was like 2016. When I joined the New York Times, they said I was the first Afghan woman journalist inside the country to work with the mainstream English language media. And that by itself is something to just ponder of like, we were in terms of like who were telling our story to the world. But when I moved to Canada, I somehow wasn't able to get back to what I loved, which was journalism. Because when you move from your country, especially when you move from global south, this is an assumption that your experience, that your knowledge is inferior to those that are in the West. So when you come here and you imagine yourself being a journalist here in the West, like eyes would go like, oh, but like you don't have the experience here, like, and then you get that sense of like, okay, that your experience is not being counted, that is not being counted at all as a journalist. Because context is one thing that you can get through progress, through being in an environment, but just not seeing that your experience being acknowledged is like a difficult experience. And I'm sure that now so many Afghan are experiencing that in all around the world, like their experience, who they were in the past is not being acknowledged. Now their first identity is being a refugee. And if they are lucky, they are living somewhere that's peaceful, at least, that they can start thinking about creating a new life for themselves, something that's not denied to most of them who are still living in limbo. But back to my story, I went back to school. I did a master in communication and culture at York University here in Toronto, Canada. And after that, I started my PhD in women and gender study. And until last August, I was just a PhD student thinking of like imagining myself as an academic in Kabul University teaching at the Department of Gender and Women Studies. And I hope that was really collapsed with August last year. And after August, so I felt that my work was needed. At the same time, I was working as a freelancer, trying to tell the story of if the Taliban come, what would happen to women. But even before we could publish that story, Taliban already took over, and that story was never published in the way I wanted that to be published. And after that, I became involved with another newsroom called Roshana Media. So I did a fundraising for them. At that time, Afghanistan was collapsing. So I was trying to help them to maintain. And we were thinking that we at least have another year of staying in Afghanistan, of trying to just think that what's happening. But the collapse was so fast. And my friend, Zahra Joy at that time, she was basically in Afghanistan and like being evacuated to London, UK. And at that time, I started working with them at their English website. So we did some great work there. But then I realized that we really need something more, an organization that really focus on women journalists, and also I call the voice of the marginalized, because we do have marginalized populations in Afghanistan that unfortunately do not have access to media, do not have access to public sphere to be able to really bring that's what is suffering to them, what they consider suffering, and the events that are happening in their lives to be able to tell that stories, because being in the media is by itself a privilege. So of course, those who are coming from the margin don't have that opportunity to be able to tell their own stories, and especially tell your story in the way you want it to be told is, I think, is a very somehow privilege that not all people have. To be able to be women journalists. So we have a lots of women journalists, of course, like in the past 20 years, media was a success story of Afghanistan, of the US coming to Afghanistan. That was like a big and huge success story. And so many women journalists, including myself, was able to work in the media during this past 20 years, the opportunity that was created for us. However, even that time, there was so many layers of discrimination that we had to go through. And we were not really able to shape our own stories, to narrate our own stories and tell it the way that we feel that is necessary to be told. But still, we were part of those newsrooms. We were there, we were visible, we were working. But when the Taliban took over, the sudden, of course, was like the collapse of so many of the achievements that was gained in the past 20 years, freedom of media, women's rights, anything that you can name it. We felt that August was the point that somehow it was the end of all of those. And women journalists, I feel, was particularly under attack because, first of all, the attack on women, when the Taliban came, women were their main target in Afghanistan. Their first degrees, their first talks, all about women, what women should wear, how should they dress, whom should they go out with, and where, like, what subject they cannot study in university, the schools, what age they can go to school. So these were all the policies that Taliban brought on women in Afghanistan. But then we have women who are particularly affected by their intersectional identities. And some of those women include women journalists who were being attacked from one part, the fact of being only women, were already intersecting by so many restrictions that the Taliban imposed. But being in the media, because media is another sector that the Taliban particularly targeted, and they issued several regulations saying what media can publish, what they cannot publish, what words they even can use. So considering that, and then being able, like, there's different policies of gender segregations, of like how women can, like dress when they're on the TV. So this is another layer that even by itself, if the Taliban do not directly dictate to the media to dismiss women journalists, they somehow feel they have to let women journalists go because that's so much cost to keep a gender segregated office, and also having the Taliban in your back that they might come every minute to investigate like how women journalists are doing. Are they sitting with the male journalists? Like so many conversation around that. So that's costly. So media somehow by themselves were forced to, let women journalists go. And now what we are seeing in Afghanistan is that women journalists have been somehow erased from Afghanistan. They might be in their own houses, but they do not have the opportunity to be able to work, to be able to continue to grab to that identity that they have been like for so long. At the same time, they lost the ability to put food on the table, to be an independent person, to continue support their family, as well as not having any opportunity, any hope for the future, any purpose to live for. And that all come together is a very, very heartbreaking story. So how can we do, for me and my colleagues, some of us who are in exile? So we came together and we thought, okay, what is our role here? What can we really do at this situation? We are all journalists. We know what happened in Afghanistan was heartbreaking, was a trauma for all of us, a trauma that we will carry for generations. However, what is our role right now? What can we do right now to at least contribute, to do something to change it? And we came up with the idea of we can come together and try to support some of those women journalists in Afghanistan to be able to continue their work from their own houses. So right now, what we are doing daily is trying to support a group of journalists, small group of journalists inside the country, for them to be able to bring the information that We want to tell, especially about the lives of women, the lives of LGBT community, especially the environment, the topics that we really see as marginalized. We want our journalists to be able to still continue bringing those stories while trying to minimize the risk for them. And as we work these days, we always consider about not only how to protect our sources, but how to protect our journalists, because that is the big question right now. We are, all of us who are working in the media is struggling. What's going to happen to my colleague? What should I do? You know, like that's even holding a journalism card, identity card is by itself having the evidence of like carrying an evidence that you're a criminal. So like, how do you really deal with that situation is a difficult question for all of us, for the media community in Afghanistan. But again, coming back to women journalists, and when we are knowing that women are the main targets of the Taliban, that they're being erased from public life, and then not having women journalists to be able to tell this story is, I think, by itself a crisis for the media, and also for Afghanistan, of course, because most of the time we always suffer from not having our story told and not being able to shape our narrative. So that's what we are trying to do at Zan Times, to trying to work together with the very minimal resources that we have to be able to bring at least some of those stories to the fore and to tell within ourselves in our own languages, and also for our international audience. I think that's the only thing that we can do, and this is our responsibility to tell the story of women in Afghanistan.